numbers are the first step that you take before starting the subject. This is the basic of math, numbers. Now when we talk about numbers, it all started from counting, and when we begin numbers we start from natural numbers. So when we talk about natural numbers, we're talking about the way we count: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and on. So these are natural numbers. Now later on came the concept of positive numbers, then came the concept of negative numbers. Of course, first came negative number, then we considered this to be positive numbers, and then even after that came 0. So negative numbers, -1, -2, -3, -4, -5, and on, then 0. So all these three together, so negative numbers, then 0. So all these three things together later came to be called as integers. So the later came to be called as integers. So natural numbers is also known as the positive integers. And negative numbers are called as the negative integers. And 0 is an integer which is neutral, so we call it a neutral integer. It is neither positive nor negative. Neutral integer. Okay, now it's helpful if you think about these integers like this vertical mast, where here we have 0, the neutral integer, and as you go up it is increasing. So the natural numbers, or the positive integers to be precise now, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, so the value is increasing. As you go down the steps, -1, -2, -3, -4, the value is decreasing. So that means -4 is a smaller number than -3. But on the other hand, +4 is larger than +3. You have to understand how positive numbers and negative numbers work. So if I say -10, it's a very small number because it is lower, down below here. But when I say -5, it is up above the -10, so it's a greater number. So -5 is a larger number than -10. But in positive numbers, +10 is a larger number than +5. So this is something that comes in handy if you visualize a vertical line. So the first and the most important concept of numbers is natural numbers, and then we have to talk about integers. Obviously, when the concept of integers came, so positive integers are the same as natural numbers, so that came later on. Now as we are talking about integers, we need to categorize integers. So integers can be categorized as even integers and odd integers. Now usually when we refer to this, we don't refer to it technically, and we refer to them as even numbers and odd numbers. But be very, very careful now. What we mean by number is a number can be anything, so we have to be specific now. So for that reason, we need to know that integer is a specific number which is a whole number. It can be positive, it can be negative, it can also be 0, which we call the neutral integer. Now integer can be subdivided into even integers and odd integers. So when anyone says even number, they are actually referring to as integer. So even integer means any integer that can be divided by 2 and we get another integer. So even integer means when we divide by 2 we get an integer, not a fraction or anything. That means divisible by 2. This thing is same as saying divisible by 2. That means you can divide it by 2 and you'll get an integer. Odd integer means not divisible by 2. So we can write some examples here. So 2 can be divided by 2, we get 1, so that's an integer. 4 can be divided by 2, 2 2s are 4, 2 is an integer. So all these things, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, these are even integers. Remember, even 0 is an even integer because 0 divided by 2 is 0 and 0 is an integer. So remember, 0 is an even integer. And the odd integers are 1, 3, 5, 7, 9 and on and on. So these are the odd integers. Now another and perhaps the most important category of integers are the prime integers. This again is commonly referred to it as prime numbers, but prime integer should be more accurately called. So prime integer, any integer more than 1, so prime number starts from 2, that cannot be divided by any number but by itself and 1. So for something to be a prime number, a prime integer, it should be divided by only two numbers, by itself and by 1. Remember, 1 cannot be a prime integer because it has to be more than 1. So in other simpler terms, a prime number or a prime integer is something that cannot be broken down. So for example, we have 2, then we have 4 can be broken down, 2 to the 4, then we have 5, 3 is also a prime number, then we have 5 cannot be divided by anything, 6 can be broken down, 3 to the 6, 7, 8 can be broken down, 4 to the 8, then we have 9, 3 to the 9, then we have 10, 5 to the 10, then 11 cannot be broken down by anything but itself and 1, then we have 12 is 6 to the 12, we have 13, 14 is 7 to the 14, 15, 3 5 the 15, 6 is 4 4 the 16, 17, then we have 19 and so on. So these are some examples of prime integers. Note that every integer is an odd number actually, except for 2. 2 is the only prime integer that is an even integer. Except for that, everything else are odd integers, obviously, because if it's even, it can be broken down and divided by 2. So this is the category of integers, and integers, we can talk about the concept of even and odd, and the most important concept of integers, they are the prime integers. Now the next category of number is breaking number down into, first of all, numbers that can be expressed with ratio. But before that, let me mention a little bit. Apart from integers, we have non-integers. Non-integers are numbers expressed as fraction, decimal. So these are non-integers. For example, 2 by 3. 2 is an integer, 3 is an integer. The upstairs portion is called the numerator and the downstairs is called denominator. Let me refer to it as upstairs and downstairs. So we have one integer divided by another integer. So since when you divide 2 with 3, you don't get anything, you don't get an integer, so we call it a fraction. Now decimal is, for example 0.5. Now decimal is similar to fraction, they're written with a point, and this 0 is not necessary. I could have just written 0.5, but this 0 is helpful to observe because sometimes you might just miss this point. That's why when writing it's advisable that you write 0.5, but in reality this is not needed at all, but we write it for visual purposes. Now 0.5 is the same as the fraction 1/2 or half. Now there is another concept when we talk about fraction and decimals. These are called ratios. Ratio. What's a ratio? For example, 1 divided by 2 can be written as 1 is to 2. So that's a ratio. For example, 2 divided by 3 can be written as 2 is to 3. So when we talk about expressing a number as a ratio, is the same as a fraction and a decimal. They're the same. We can write it as a fraction or we can write it as a decimal. So this is any number that can be written as a ratio is just two integers, which is a fraction. Now the next category of number is rational number. Rational numbers. If you notice the first 3-4 words, letters, RATIO, rational, we call it rational numbers. Rational numbers are numbers that can be expressed. Numbers that can be expressed as an integer or as a ratio of integers. So that means whenever you have a number that can be expressed as an integer or a ratio of integer, ratio of integers. So integer means, you know, the whole numbers 1 2 3 4, and ratio of integers, they are fractions, decimals. So that's what's a rational number. So most of the numbers are rational numbers. Every integer is a rational number. So let me give you some examples. For example, 5 is a rational number. 2 by 3 is a rational number because it can be expressed as the ratio of two integers. 1.5 is a rational number because 1.5 can be written as 15 by 10. These are integers. And this can also be written as 5 3 is a 15, 5 2 is a 10. So this is an integer. Even square root of 16 is a rational number because square root of 16 can be expressed as an integer 4. So these are all rational numbers. So rational numbers is any number that can be expressed using an integer or a ratio of an integer. So the next concept is irrational numbers. Irrational numbers. So irrational numbers are numbers that cannot be cannot be expressed either as an integer or as a ratio of integer. So any number that cannot be expressed as an integer or a ratio of integer, that's called an irrational number. That's an irrational number. So let me give an example. For example, pi is the ratio of the circumference to the diameter. 3.1412, it goes on forever. So you cannot express it as an integer and you cannot express it as a ratio of integers. In some books, class 4 or 5 textbooks, pi is expressed as 22 by 7. That is not correct. That's a mistake. Pi cannot be expressed as 22 by 7. For some reason, for simplicity, it can be written in textbooks as 22 by 7, but remember that is inaccurate. So pi is an irrational number. Then square root of 2. Square root of 2 cannot be expressed as an integer. It cannot be expressed as a ratio of integers. It will be always square root of 2 and it will be 1.41 something something something, and same with square root of 3 and on. So remember, these numbers of square roots and pi, these are irrational numbers, numbers that cannot be expressed as integers or ratio of integers. So The concept here is for numbers, so let me review what we have talked about. So the first thing you need to know, what is a natural number? The next thing is, what is an integer? So you know, an integer can be positive integer, which are actually natural numbers, negative integers, and zero is an integer, it has no sign, it's a neutral integer. Next, what are the types of integers? That means even and odd integers, and the concept of prime integers, that is very, very important. Then what are non-integers? So non-integers are fractions, decimals, and ratios. So they are one and the same thing, they can be interchanged and written like that. Then what are rationals and irrationals, or rational numbers and irrational numbers? So this is the concept of numbers. So whenever you're thinking about numbers, these are the basic concept that needs to be remembered.